Most people know the Medici family as the family that made Florence rich, famous, and beautiful. But if you've ever wondered how a family of sheepherders could afford to build so much culture and sponsor so many geniuses, then this is the video for you. Welcome to the channel. Well, not from wealth, that's for sure. The Medici started out as simple wool merchants in 14th century Florence, but quickly rose to prominence thanks to one man, Giovanni de' Medici, who would become the first head of the Medici banking dynasty. But as we'll see, Manitas and the Medici were about to turn Florence into a kingdom. When he took over the family business in 1397, Florence was one of the most prosperous republics in Italy. But without the Medici, that wouldn't have happened because, like any good bankers, they understood the importance of branding. And from that point on, the Medici essentially became the leaders of Florence. And together they were able to cement their own political influence and build some of the most exquisite art that the world has ever seen. Botticelli painted the famous Primavera and the Birth of Venus for the Medici. But before that happened, they accomplished three major things that changed the world forever. First, the Medici introduced the concept of creditworthiness and judged clients not just on their income, but also their character and future prospects. Second, they created a reputation for discretion and confidentiality, which led to the development of modern banking laws regarding privacy. And the Medici became so wealthy that their rivals couldn't compete. So to answer our questions from the beginning, the Medici didn't just fund beauty. They engineered the systems that allowed modern finance and culture to flourish. And third, they were the first to hold deposits and lend them at interest. And today, echoes of their methods can still be seen in investment banking, political funding, and arts patronage. In fact, when you look at today's billionaires and their influence on culture and finance, it's hard not to see the Medici all over again. So the real question is, will the next Renaissance be funded by today's billionaires? And at what cost? And although lending money at interest was banned by the church's youth, they disguised the practice by calling it a sale, making it seem like a financial transaction rather than a loan. These methods weren't perfect, and in fact, their collapse in 1494 was due in part to bad loans and political overreach. But despite their flaws, the Medici pioneered practices that are still used by modern banks to this day. And Michelangelo was commissioned to create the magnificent David, which remains one of the most iconic sculptures of all time. Meanwhile, Leonardo da Vinci arrived in Florence to paint the Adoration of the Magi for the wealthy Medici bank. And for a moment, it seemed as though the Medici legacy would end there. But just 5 years later, the Pazzi were overthrown and Cosimo de' Medici returned to power. From that point on, Florence enjoyed a golden age of peace and prosperity. Artists flocked to the city, including Raphael, who painted the School of Athens in the Vatican. And soon, the Medici influence spread throughout Europe. And upon seeing his talent, Lorenzo made him court painter and gave him a generous salary. For a while, it seemed as though the Medici were invincible. They dominated Italian banking. They controlled Florence from the shadows. And they had managed to bring together the greatest artists of all time. See, the secret to the Medici's success was that they knew how to take advantage of the system without breaking it. Unlike other rich families, the Medici didn't try to buy titles or force their way into government. Instead, they married into prominent families, produced two popes, Leo X and Clement VII, and aligned themselves with the church through shady deals involving stolen relics. It was during this period that the Medici truly reached their peak. In fact, 2 centuries later, a writer named Machiavelli would describe Cosma as the pater patriae, or father of the fatherland. And that pretty much sums up the Medici's influence. Not only did they fund Brunelleschi, but they brought in Donatello to sculpt David and Fra Angelico to paint the Church of San Marco. Meanwhile, Cosimo's son, Piero, built the Medici chapel and hired Botticelli to paint the magnificent Adoration of the Magi. And by the end of the century, Florence was the heart of the Renaissance and the Medici were at its center. And no better way existed to promote the Medici name than by building beautiful buildings. And when his father died in 1402, Giovanni became immensely wealthy. So he spent little time mourning and took full advantage of his opportunity. He grew his fortune trading wool with England and France, then deposited his earnings in a small Florentine bank called St. George. This wasn't unusual. Most rich people back then kept their cash in banks. But while everyone else saw banks as a place to store valuables, Giovanni saw them as an opportunity to make more money. So he borrowed some of the customers' cash and lent it to nobles at higher interest rates. Then, when those loans paid off, he gave the customers their original deposit back and pocketed the difference. Now, this isn't exactly ethical, but as we'll see, it's completely legal. And Giovanni had a genius plan to expand his business all across Europe. Because unlike what you might have heard, the Medici didn't just fund art. They invented the financial systems we still use today. Without them, there might be no Michelangelo, no Leonardo, and no modern banks, as we know them. Here are the craziest things that the Medici family did to save Florence and change the world. Okay, first things first. Where did these guys even come from? He set up branches in Rome, London, and Bruges, and created a system that historians call correspondent banking, which is basically the idea that customers could write checks in one city and get their value back in another. He also pioneered early letters of credit so that nobles traveling abroad wouldn't have to carry enough cash with them. And he reorganized accounting rules to allow double-entry bookkeeping, which is still used today. But his greatest innovation was how he prioritized trust, secrecy, and long-term relationships instead of quick profits. This made him immensely popular with customers, and within 20 years, he was able to build a massive network and amass a fortune of around $400 million in today's money. Now, remember, Florence was a republic, so theoretically no one could become too powerful. By the 1450s, Florence was overflowing with riches, and thanks to the invention of perspective, artists could finally depict all of its glory. So when Brunelleschi began planning his dome for the Florence Cathedral, Cosimo de' Medici stepped in to fund it. Now, it's important to note that, technically speaking, the Medici never ruled Florence. But that's kind of the whole point. Lorenzo il Magnifico ruled Florence alongside his brother Giuliano. But unfortunately, the Medici story doesn't have a happy ending. Despite their best efforts, the Medici eventually lost control of Florence, and they ended up losing everything. And as crazy as it sounds, things could have turned out very differently. After the Medici fell, Florence became a kingdom ruled by the rival family, the Pazzi. In fact, the Medici became so prominent that almost every royal family in Europe intermarried with them to gain favor. In the end, the Medici left an indelible mark on the world. Alright everyone, that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.